We've been talking about what we tell ourselves, the things that go on in our mind. We effectively live out the words that go on in our mind. Our mind is like the manager of reality and our inner self. It's like the go-between. And we have something called mind talk that goes all the time. We constantly evaluating reality, thinking about it, telling ourselves. And the question we're really needing to explore, and we are exploring, is what do we tell ourselves? How do we interpret reality and manage it in terms of our inner expectations? Our mind is almost like the one that makes sense, or that justifies, or that nullifies, or that distorts reality for us. Last week we were talking about what is, and we were saying that we don't see what is, we see what could be. We don't see what things as they are. We see things as how they could be, or shouldn't be, or must be, or have to be. And so we see ourselves always in transition. We don't see ourselves as present. It's very difficult to be present because our mind tends to think, well, if we had supper, we'd be happier. Or what are we going to eat for breakfast? Or when is my friend coming? Or it's always sort of moving away from the present, because it manages its reality in terms of how can it actually improve or change or fix what is. And we've been developing this mind talk all our lives. And from early on, we were told, be good, be kind, be polite, say sorry, say thank you. So there was always something we had to be and become to be acceptable, so that just to be ourselves is actually very difficult. So our mind talk is what goes on in our mind, saying, be careful of this, and that, what do they think? Who do they think they are? Or I really must, get close to this person. They're very popular. Or I can't stand it when I get things wrong. Or there's constant chatter going on in our mind, and that's what controls the way we are. And most of it is saying when, then. So it's taking us away from the present and almost positing how it should be or could be or would be if it were different when we get home, when we get married, when we have a better car, when we do this, when we do that. We tend to live a lot of our lives in contingency. And it's very popular to say we're living in the now, but actually it's very difficult because our mind has been so trained to live in the possibility, in the idealization, in the theorization, that to actually put that on hold and actually be able to just sit and be, it can actually be quite a trial. Try sitting with nothing to do and nothing to think of for 5 minutes, and it's actually very difficult. The time doesn't seem to pass. You just sit in contemplation and watch the clock. And it takes hours, whereas when you're busy, your mind is constantly working and time is flying. And the more you in your mind talk, the faster time flies, because it's always positing how it could be and how it isn't at the moment. And so we're needing to almost like understand what our mind talk is saying, because a lot of it is driving, but a lot of it is also criticizing. How many of us don't feel terrible about ourselves when certain things go wrong? I remember a guy sitting here saying, I loathe myself. And I remember saying to him, but who taught you to loathe yourself? He says, if I could destroy myself now without hurting anybody, I would do it. To get to a point where we feel things about ourselves, that our mind is justifying what we feel. Because our mind talk, whenever a feeling comes up, it tries to make sense of the feeling. And what it usually does is it assumes something about that feeling. So if I'm uncomfortable, I look around and say, well, what's making me uncomfortable? My mind is doing. And it says, it must be because Marcus didn't bring his dog, or whatever it is. And if there's nothing to stop that assumption, it becomes a belief. And how many people don't say, I'm ugly? They assume that. And then they believe that, and then they act on that. or I'm like this, or I'm like that. And so our mind talk is, as we've said, we are the easiest person to fool, because we'll believe anything our mind talk tells us. And the trouble with our mind talk is that it is historic, and it was programmed into us over the years by all the people who had significant input into our lives. So something will go wrong, and you'll remember a teacher 30 years ago saying you'll never amount to anything. And that voice is still in your head, just still. Every time something goes wrong, well, what do you think? Who do you think you are? You'll never amount to anything. So things said over us, into us, have a profound influence on us. So last week I left us with the question of, how much of, what are we waiting for in our lives? What are we waiting for to live fully? Because most of us are waiting for something. We're not fully, this is who I am, this is where I am, and this is how I am now, and I'm at home in this. We're usually waiting for something, to pass something, to finish something, to pay off the bond, to get a new car, to find another partner, to get the flowers to bloom, to clean the house. We're part of a process. We're doing creatures rather than being creatures. And we measure ourselves by our productivity, because we've been taught from young that we are as much as we produce. And we're constantly measured. We all know our measure. We know each other's measure. We know who produces and who doesn't produce. We know how much we produce. We know what measure we have, who's got and who hasn't got. Because society has measured us from the day we were born, conceived in fact. We've been measured all the time. And so do we measure up or don't? And we're constantly engaged in that process of fulfilling the measure. And we measure each other. You introduce yourself or get somebody to introduce. They tell you what do they do, where they live, how many, if they're married or not. It's all functional stuff. They never say what they feel. They never say who they really are. They're always saying what they're doing and what they're owning and what they're influencing, because that's how we measure ourselves and each other. So in looking at our lives, when we say how much, what are we waiting for in our lives, how much of our present moment is that stealing? Because our present moment is the only moment we're alive, and what we do with our lives is what we're doing in this moment. And if this moment is taken thinking about what tomorrow is going to be like, I've lost the moment. And if I've lost the moment, I've lost tomorrow. And so you see how easy it is to actually find our lives slipping through our fingers, because we're always waiting for something else. We're waiting for the next program, the next friend, the next phone call, the next whatever. And it's not that being in the moment is somehow, how can I say it? It's not that we have to sort of have nothing to look forward to or to move into, but there's a different quality of being when you're not living for some other moment. There's a different quality. There's a different sense in presence. It's like when you're talking to a friend and you're deep in conversation, and the time passes, and you're drinking a good glass of wine, and 4 hours have passed, and you say, "Wow, that was good." We were just present to each other. We weren't trying to be or trying not to be anything. We were just there. So we're needing to understand, or we need to grasp what our mind is doing, because we see through this filter which we call our mind, and the filter makes us think that what we see is real, but it's not. It's our interpretation of what's real, what our mind wants us to believe is real. Two people will see reality differently because they have their own interpretation of it. And if we don't understand what we're seeing, we actually will become invested in what we're seeing, and we'll lose the self that we have. So we're not only losing the moment, we're losing the self. You understand what I'm saying? We become invested in what isn't. We become connected with how it could be, how it should be, how it wasn't, or how it isn't. And we haven't got the simplicity of just being at home, rooted in ourselves, in the true self. Because the false self is the self that keeps managing reality with its mind talk. The true self almost comes home to itself and just is what it is. A child doesn't have mind talk. A child is just play. It just sits there and it fiddles in the mud and goes in and does a poo or whatever it is. It's like it's just constantly present. It's not trying to manufacture a process or be part of something else.